1,000 meters. Like, that was what I realized today when I was coming here, passed by the GPO on O'Connell Street, look up the statue, the great iconic statue, take out my phone again to do a Google Maps and realize, you know, here I am pitching for a statue for Daniel O'Connell when there already is a gigantic one only 1,000 meters away. But then, as our chair has wonderfully said, I thought I could get away with that. And then I go upstairs to get ready and collect my thoughts. And I see this wonderful diorama of 3 Irish people suffering. And there's a great figure towering over them with a document in their hand, probably Emancipation Act or something, giving them their freedom. Very clearly Daniel O'Connell. And I think, here we go again. Thanks, Trevor White. You know, not only am I tasked with making a case in the Little Museum of Dublin for a Kerry man, I have to make a case for a statue to be built with the money that we are all contributing to when there's already one upstairs. And I think the odds are very much stacked against me, already 1-0 down in this contest. And I think very soon to have it as 2-0. Daniel O'Connell does have, of course, many connections with Dublin. He was the first Catholic Lord Mayor of Dublin in almost a century and a half. In 1841, elected Lord Mayor of Dublin. And that was only made possible by, first of all, the winning of emancipation, which he had achieved in the 1820s, and then all of the reforms that he had brought in the 1830s. And as Lord Mayor, almost as a chief magistrate, he made sure that there was fairness in the system. He was proud that his very first case was a one where he decided against the Catholic priest who had come and in favour of the Protestant who was there, because he wanted to show that in this new Ireland that he was trying to create, there would be no religious prejudices. It would not be a sectarian state. He was an MP for 7 different constituencies between 1830 and 1847, twice represented Dublin City, and that this was the constituency that he represented for the longest. And he spent by far the greatest portion of his life here in Dublin. It was here in 1845 that he greeted Frederick Douglass, the African-American abolitionist who had escaped from the bondage of slavery, had made his way to the northern states, and then had been told that it wasn't safe for his life in America, that the slavers were going to capture him and re-enslave him and bring him back to the South. And so he decided that he would raise support for the cause in Europe. And where was the first place that he came to? He came to Ireland and he came to Dublin because he wanted to hear his great hero speak, Daniel O'Connell, because he said that growing up, he had learned to love the name of Daniel O'Connell because his master used to spit out the name with a curse. And he had heard all of these great stories of Daniel O'Connell's oratory, and he refused to believe them. He thought, there is no way one person can project their voice so powerfully and be heard across the fields. And they met, they got on well, and they spoke at an anti-slavery rally in Dublin. And O'Connell spoke, and Douglas wrote afterwards that all the stories were true. That listening to O'Connell, it was like listening to the rolling of thunder across a dusty summer's afternoon. And O'Connell introduced Douglas with typical modesty as the Black O'Connell of the United States, and said that, and predicted that he would become this great figure in the cause of American slavery. And it's something that we forget. I think if I was perhaps addressing a crowd outside of Ireland, the name of O'Connell perhaps resonates more than it resonates in our own country. That Daniel O'Connell was someone who in the 19th century was an international figure because he had led a movement which had achieved such a great reform as civil rights in Ireland and Britain without the drop of a single ounce of blood, without any violence whatsoever. That, the channeling of moral force in a mass democratic movement, that marked him out as extraordinary, but also for his championing of the abolitionist cause. And Daniel O'Connell did it even though it was unpopular, even though it earns him significant criticism from people in the United States who wrote to him and said, we are anti-slavery as well, but we think you should shut up and stop, because Americans do not like foreigners telling them how to run their country. And O'Connell refused to stop. When a senator came to visit him in the House of Commons in the 1830s, O'Connell asked him, are you a slave owner? And the man was from Alabama, and he said yes. And O'Connell slammed the door in his face. And it was something that horrified Queen Victoria, who thought this was an example of the lack of manners of that brutish O'Connell. But again, O'Connell didn't mind. O'Connell went out of his way almost to shock and offend Americans. He said America is a contaminated country because of the sin of slavery. And he said that he would never set foot upon the soil until it had got rid of that sin. He said that George Washington was a hypocrite because he owned slaves and only freed them on his deathbed. And he said the Declaration of Independence was a flawed document because all men were not created equal. And he predicted that a great calamity would come in the United States, and that it would take such a calamity for real freedom and real independence to be achieved. And in the 1840s, American groups in the United States cut off aid to O'Connell and Repeal because they disapproved of his stance on slavery. Charles Dickens covers it in his novel Martin Chuzzlewit. And again, O'Connell refused to budge. It was one of the reasons why Daniel O'Connell fell out with the Young Irelanders, because the Young Irelanders wanted to keep that American money. And you see in people like John Mitchell, they had their ambition. What was it Mitchell said? I want to go to America and I want to buy a plantation and own 300 slaves, and ended up in America and becoming a great friend of the Confederate President Jefferson Davis. So O'Connell was someone who was able to speak about slavery with a passion and an intensity that moved people because he understood it on a really deep emotional level. Other white people spoke about slavery in the 19th century as a terrible thing because of it being a moral crime, because of what it did for the white owners, that it corrupted them, that it was a sin, that it was a wrong. But O'Connell spoke about slavery as a great evil because of what it did to the people who were enslaved. And he would speak about it in Ireland and in England and around on his tours, and he would make his audience break down in tears when he would draw them a picture of the horrors of slavery, of the mothers who would have their children taken off them and sold into slavery, the women who were abused and beaten. He would talk about the pregnant women, and who, instead of believing that they were about to give birth to a blessing, instead only felt that they were about to pass on a curse. He was someone who the American ambassador to Britain challenged to a duel in 1836 because O'Connell denounced him as a slave owner and a slave breeder. And he asked for O'Connell to withdraw the words, and O'Connell said, oh, no, I didn't say those words. And the ambassador thought he was vindicated. And O'Connell said, oh, no, I said far worse words than those. And O'Connell believed that any American who owned slaves should be called out for it, that they should be denounced like a wolf in the field. And John Quincy Adams, the former president of the United States, who was at that stage back in the House of Representatives, took to the floor of Congress to denounce a Southern conspiracy, a slave-owning conspiracy against the life of Daniel O'Connell. In 1841, there was the world's first anti-slavery convention in London, and O'Connell spoke. And there were great abolitionists there from America, like the great black abolitionist Charles Lennox Remond. And he wrote about how all his life he thought he was an abolitionist, but he was wrong. Listening to O'Connell made him realize what true abolitionism was. And he said that O'Connell's scorching denunciations of the slave owners seemed to make the walls shake. And he said that it was like watching lightning flash across the sky. And O'Connell felt that on an emotional level because he felt growing up, it wasn't the same type of oppression, but he felt growing up that every single Irish Catholic endured a similar form of humiliation. That O'Connell said that you could walk down any street in Ireland and you could immediately tell who the Catholics were. They wouldn't make eye contact with you. They would bow their eyes down, they would shuffle along, bad posture because they were afraid, they were broken down, they were defeated. And that's why one of the things O'Connell set out to do was to make himself a symbol of resistance, make himself a symbol of defiance, to stand up to the Protestant judges, to stand up to the aristocracy, to stand up to the people who had been oppressing them for centuries, and to make himself a champion. And we see how he did it as an orator. We see how he did it in the courtrooms. Daniel O'Connell was called to the bar in 1798, part of the first generation of Catholics to be allowed to practice and become lawyers. And so he found himself, at the very junior run. No Catholic could become a king's counsel. No Catholic can become a judge. And the judges were very much determined to keep it that way. At one of his very first cases, the judge was bullying another young lawyer called Richard, refusing to allow the case to be heard. And O'Connell intervened and he said, "My lord, that case should go to be heard, and here are the reasons why." And the judge was furious and he said, "Mr. O'Connell, sit down and shut up. You do not have a brief in this case, so it is none of your business." And O'Connell refused to sit down. And he said, "My lord, if this case does go to trial, I will get a brief, so it is my business." And the judge said, "Mr. O'Connell, when I was a young lawyer at the bar, it was not my habit to anticipate what briefs I would get." And O'Connell just held his ground. He pointed his finger at him and he said, "My lord, when you were at the bar, I did not take you as my model. And now that you're on the bench, I will not suffer your dictation." And the judge, absolutely humiliated, forced to back down, allowed the case to go to trial. On another occasion, O'Connell was asking for a piece of evidence to be introduced. The judge kept refusing. No, that wasn't the law. Court adjourned for the day. The next day, court resumed, and the judge says, "Well, I've considered it over the night, and I've decided I will allow that piece of evidence to be presented." Now, what would a lawyer do today? They would praise the wisdom of the judge, how benevolent, how wise, how clever. What did O'Connell do? He stood up and he said, "My lord, if you knew as much law yesterday as you do today, what an amount of time and effort and money you would have saved me and my client." And then without allowing the judge he says, "Crier, present that piece of evidence." And it said the judge, absolutely humiliated, but remained absolutely silent. So O'Connell was making himself a symbol of resistance. We see it in a very famous case, the McGee trial in 1813, where O'Connell used it as an opportunity to denounce the Attorney General, denounce British rule in Ireland, denounce Robert Peel, the Chief Secretary, someone who on a previous occasion he had dismissed as orange peel and said that he had been forced out of some factory in England. And at the meeting, incredibly tense court case where the judges wouldn't allow O'Connell to proceed. And the judge allowed the Attorney General, a man called William Sauron, to speak, and he gave a very intemperate speech attacking O'Connell. And when O'Connell was finally allowed to respond, O'Connell stood up and he said, "My lord, I'm glad that the Attorney General said those words here where he's protected by all of you, because if he said that anywhere else, I would horsewhip him." And, uproar in the court. Two of the judges on the bench were asleep. They woke up at that and they said, "Mr. O'Connell, I think we misheard you. What did you say?" And he goes, "Oh, apologies. What I was saying was, I'm glad that man said those words here, where there's soldiers and other guards to protect him, because otherwise I would horsewhip him." Absolute uproar. The judge said, "Mr. O'Connell, we could have you arrested right now for contempt. Will you please clarify what you're saying?" And he goes, "Oh, of course, no, I will. I am glad that snivelling wretch, that coward, said what he said about me here, where he's protected, because if he said that anywhere else, I would horsewhip him." Now, at that point, the Attorney General intervened, and wanting to tone things down and dial down, he apologised to O'Connell for the offence that had been caused, and the trial was allowed to resume. But all of this made O'Connell a marked man, and they were determined to put a stop to him if they could. And around this time, there were question marks about O'Connell's courage, about his character. people said, he's a coward. He won't fight. And it all stemmed from a court case around that time where O'Connell was running rings around the opposing counsel, a man called Maurice McGrath. And McGrath got so angry, he kicked O'Connell underneath the bench. And O'Connell was so furious, he took up his leather brief bag and hit McGrath across the face. Well, the two men were still angry when they left, so McGrath challenged him to a duel. They arranged to meet. They went to the field of battle. Pistols were being loaded, and then a friend of both men intervened and said, look, everyone saw you hit him. No one saw him kick you. He's going to give you a big apology. If you accept the apology and shake hands, it can all be brought to an end. And O'Connell agreed, and the men shook hands and the duel was cancelled. But that went against the code of honour which surrounded duelling in those days. You could agree a compromise, a truce at any point, but not once you had arrived at the field of battle. Then it looked like you were backing down because you were a coward. And that's what people began to say about O'Connell. He's a coward. He won't fight. He's against bloodshed. And so a trap was sprung. And the funny thing about the trap is that for all of the really aggressive things that O'Connell had said in the course of his career, it was actually a very minor sentence that got him into the trouble. In 1815, he gave a speech where he denounced Dublin Corporation as a beggarly corporation. But a trap was sprung, and a member of the corporation, a man called John Norcott de Stair, who was a former Royal Marine and a crack shot, he was persuaded to issue a challenge to O'Connell. And he set off to the Four Courts, and he brought with him the son of the Attorney General, both men carrying horsewhips, so that no one would be in any doubt that this was a reference to the great insult that had been made a couple of years previously. And they called out O'Connell to fight, saying he's a coward, he won't fight, where is he? Storming off around the city, telling everyone that O'Connell was a coward. And O'Connell, realising he had no choice, went to his friend Major McNamara and arranged for the duel to be fought. And they met just outside the outskirts of Dublin in County Kildare, and O'Connell made his will before he went, and they were there on the field. The pistols were being loaded, and Major McNamara, O'Connell's great friend, started, fixing his cravat and, taking out some chains that were around him because he didn't want the bullet to go in there and cause extra damage, and started giving him advice about how to fight the duel. And O'Connell just put his arms on him and said, "My dear friend, can I ask one thing of you?" And McNamara said, "Anything." "Please shut up and don't say another word until the duel is over." So the men were lined up 10 paces apart. It was said that the Stair could snuff out a candle from 10 paces. The signal was given for the men to fire. The Stair raised his pistol, fired. The bullet hit the ground at O'Connell's feet. And a split second later, O'Connell raised his pistol, fired, and the Stair fell. And immediately a crowd that had gathered cheered. They gathered O'Connell in their arms. He was brought to his carriage, brought back to Dublin. And on the way back, his friends were delirious with excitement. And they said, Dan, I think you got him. I think you killed him. I think you hit him in the head." And O'Connell said, "No, I hit him in the leg, but I fear from the way he fell that it's going to prove fatal." And they said, but how can you know? It all happened so quickly. How can you know where you hit him? And O'Connell said, "I hit him in the leg. I could have hit him anywhere I chose." Because O'Connell had known that a challenge like this would one day come. And so he had always carried around a case of pistols with him whenever he was traveling the countryside for his legal work. And he had always practiced his shooting along the way so that he had made himself a crack shot. And people sometimes say that that's what turned O'Connell against violence, but it wasn't. Because O'Connell went out of his way a few months later to challenge Robert Peel to a duel. And O'Connell's wife Mary intervened. He was arrested. He promised his wife he wouldn't fight the duel. And then he arranged to fight it in France. And he made his way to England and he was rearrested there. And it was made very clear that there would be a public prosecution if the duel went ahead, no matter what the result was. And so it was. But it was only in later years. And the truth is, at that point, see, our image of O'Connell is very much the O'Connell of that statue on O'Connell Street. It's the O'Connell of the larger man, O'Connell in his later years, O'Connell of the 1840s, against violence no matter what. And we read his history and his life backwards. But that wasn't the O'Connell of the earlier years. The O'Connell of the 1790s joined the United Irishmen in Dublin. He attended the meetings. He spoke out and was reported to Dublin Castle for being a radical revolutionary. His great hero was Lord Edward Fitzgerald, and he liked to go up and see him on the streets, and then in later years say, just the way young people like to do to me these days. He was someone who then, in 1815, followed up the killing of de Stair with the attempts of another duel. He was someone who lost his faith in London and wasn't a practicing Catholic for all of that period, until in 1816 he found a Catholic confessor on the Clarendon Church, the Carmelites, right here in town beside us. And so he returned to the Catholic faith. But for that first 16 years when O'Connell was campaigning for emancipation, it was as someone who wasn't a practicing Catholic himself at all. But O'Connell, his faith restored, ended up becoming increasingly religious. And in the 1820s, this began to weigh heavily on his mind, and more again in the 1830s, especially after his wife died, that there was blood on his hands, that his wife he hoped was in heaven, but that he might never get to join her because of it. And so when he would offend people in the British House of Commons, Benjamin Disraeli, Henry Harding, who he called a one-armed miscreant. He had lost his arm at Waterloo, but he became the one-armed miscreant for O'Connell, a chance child of love and war, denouncing Benjamin Disraeli, denouncing all of these figures. He would be challenged to duels, but he would refuse to fight because he would tell them, I think a duel is a very bad way of deciding who is wrong and who is right. And to higher society in England, he was a scoundrel because of it, because they could not understand how someone could offend so freely with his words and then afterwards refuse to apologise or back up his words with a duel. But O'Connell didn't care what they thought. He followed his own moral compass, and it is that which led him during it. And why was he such a great orator? Again, we misread that. We think it's, oh, look at his physical frame, look at his size, that it must have been some great gift. But it wasn't. He trained himself to be a great orator in the same way that he trained himself to be a great crackshot, in the same way he trained himself to be a great lawyer. He was someone who watched the great public speakers in England in the 1790s and would then go to the theatre in Dublin when he was back here and watch how the great actors of the time performed on the stage and how they could project their voices. And he put as much effort into getting that right as he did into anything else. The other problem I think that we have with O'Connell is that as Ireland changed and as Ireland became more secular, we don't really understand what Catholic emancipation meant. I think the very name itself is a wrong one. That we should call it what it really was, the campaign for civil rights. That it was the campaign to make sure that Catholics could sit in Parliament, that Catholics could become judges, that the Catholics could take up all of these offices. But it was more than that, because that was only going to affect a small number of people. But this was a cause that meant something for the whole people, because it was really about removing a sense of inferiority, a badge of inferiority that was on every single Catholic person who grew up not believing that they would ever have the full rights, that they would never be equal in their own country. And it very much was a broken down movement. The meetings of the Catholic Association in 1823 would have less than 10 people at them. And 10 was the quorum, so the meetings would be adjourned. No one was going. A broken down people. And O'Connell came up with this idea, let's democratise the movement. Let's not just have it as a meeting of the farmers and the merchants and the well-off. Let's open this to everyone. Let's crowdsource a penny a month scheme so that everyone could feel a part of it. But when he tried to propose this, the meetings kept having to be cancelled because there weren't 10 people. And O'Connell at one meeting, the meetings were held above a bookstore in Dublin, he had to go downstairs. There were 2 priests there. Priests were honorary members. He had to ask them to go upstairs. They wouldn't. They weren't going to get involved in politics. So he just pushed them up the stairs. The count was taken, 10 people. And so the meeting was allowed to continue. And O'Connell was mocked for his penny a month scheme. His son John was in Clongowes and wrote in later years about all the other boys would make fun of him and tease him. Oh, your father's going to free us, is he, with his penny a month? But it grew in momentum. And just like with crowdsourcing and crowdfunding and how everyone can take part, people began to feel part of the movement. It was no longer just speaking to the elite. It was speaking to everyone. And so in 1828, O'Connell decided, wherever there is another election, wherever on the island, I am going to stand. Because there was nothing to stop a Catholic from running. It just stopped them from taking their seat. And the next by-election, it was called suddenly in County Clare. And he set off from the forecourts. And his carriage was greeted by huge crowds all the way down to Ennis. People coming out of their homes in the middle of the night to touch the carriage as it went by, to unhitch the horses so they could bring it into their town and celebrate him. In Clare, they stopped saying, God be with you, for the 3 weeks of the election campaign. Instead, they started to say, O'Connell be with you. And elections in Ireland in those days were famous for 2 things. A lot of drinking of alcohol, and then a lot of fights, which usually followed all that drinking of alcohol. And 3,000 British soldiers were sent down to Clare with orders to open fire at the first sign of any trouble. So O'Connell sent down what became known as the Order. There was to be no drinking of alcohol for the entire duration of the campaign. There was to be no retaliation or violence, no matter what the provocation. And that order held. And Robert Peel, who was now the Home Secretary, he said that British power in Ireland was now shivered to atoms because they no longer controlled the country, that whatever O'Connell told the people to do, they did. And O'Connell won a stunning victory in County Clare. And the news of that victory was telegraphed all around the island by people lighting bonfires and using that to spread the message. That O'Connell was put on a chair and carried in the chair all the way from Cork to Limerick. And there in Limerick, he tried to speak, and for the first time in his life, no one could hear him because everyone was cheering and applauding. And he told them that for the first time in his life, he was happy not to be able to be heard. And we see then that the British government forced to concede emancipation. The King, George IV, determined to block it and tries to replace the Prime Minister and bring in a new government to stop it. And the Prime Minister, the Duke of Wellington, is forced to tell the King, I defeated Napoleon at Waterloo. I could easily defeat O'Connell if he rose up in a rebellion, but I cannot defeat this. We cannot open fire on unarmed people. We cannot defeat a peaceful revolution. And so the King was forced to concede emancipation, and the King was forced to say, I am no longer the King of Ireland. O'Connell is now the King of Ireland. And what was the name the Irish people gave O'Connell? Liberator. Because it was seen as a liberation. It was seen as a raising of the people from their knees. And of course, O'Connell thrived on this, and he loved it. In the 1830s, journalists would ask him, who is the greatest figure in Irish history? And he would say, Henry Grattan, after myself. He would meet school children and he would ask them, do you know who I am? And if they didn't, he'd say, I'm the person who won you your freedom. And there was a dark side to O'Connell. He could be a bully, he could be aggressive, he was bad with money, and there were various fallings out for every single movement he was involved in the 1810s, the 1820s, the 1830s, and in the 1840s, where treasurers had suspicions about the money and where O'Connell's only defence was that the money was resting in his account. Because O'Connell didn't really see the difference between his outlay and the outlay of the movement, because he saw himself as the movement and that things very much had to be done his way, or he didn't want them to be done at all. And yet, despite all of that, we see his genius when it came to rallying people. And we see it with that great movement for repeal in the 1840s, a movement which also had found itself reduced to apathy, because again they felt they weren't going to achieve anything. And O'Connell at the start of 1843 announced that this would be the year of repeal, and again people laughed. But this time he decided on another new innovation, that he would travel around the countryside and give people an opportunity to hear what he had to say, for him to explain why Ireland should have its own parliament, and for Britain to see just how many people in Ireland were behind this new crusade, and just how much support there was for it. 50,000 people at the first meeting in Trim, gathering up to those truly monster meetings, a term of abuse that the London Times gave it, but which was soon taken on as a badge of honour. Huge crowds gathering at Tara, huge crowds gathering at Mullamast. O'Connell seeming to be crowned like a king when they presented him with a hat with a gold band. And O'Connell was very much terrifying the British government, who thought, this is someone who's going to raise the people in rebellion. But O'Connell would not do that. O'Connell believed that this was a movement that needed to achieve it through exclusively peaceful means. And so when the government intervened and declared the meeting at Clontarf illegal, the scene of Brian Boru's great victory in 1014, O'Connell made the decision that I think so many of us have not forgiven him for. He decided to cancel it because he would not walk with the Irish people into a massacre. He knew then that the country would rise up in a rebellion, but it didn't matter to him whether that rebellion succeeded or failed. There would be far too much blood shed, and he would not have that on his conscience. It was a decision backed by the Young Irelanders and those around him at the time, but who then afterwards denounced it and thought it was the wrong one. And O'Connell was put on trial in this city in Dublin. And he found that when the jury was being selected, the pages that included the names of the eligible Catholic jurors had all been mysteriously ripped out of the book, so that it was an exclusively Protestant jury that was formed. And O'Connell was found guilty and sentenced to time in prison. And it was here in Dublin at Richmond Barracks that he was imprisoned, and where people from all around the country sent him chickens and fowl and food and supplies and musical entertainments, because he was not just a figure in Ireland, he was a figure internationally, and people around the world who came to see him. And he was released because when they had to investigate the circumstances of his conviction, Judge Denham in Britain was forced to conclude that if this was allowed to continue, if the conviction was allowed to stand, justice in Ireland would become a mockery, a snare, and a delusion. And O'Connell was freed, and 500,000 people gathered in Dublin to cheer and celebrate his release. And as he went on a tour around Dublin, stopping at College Green, the home of the old Irish Parliament, where he raised that hat that people saw as a crown, and they cheered for him. But then came the split with Young Ireland, and then came the great catastrophe that was to break his heart, the Great Irish Famine. And from 1845 on, that was the only thing that he was thinking of, using his own money to make sure that his own tenants in County Kerry didn't starve, and to make sure that the people of Kerry were protected. Looking into meteorological charts, trying to examine what was going wrong, how could they fix it? And his health fading, his spirits broken-hearted by what he was seeing, and knowing that this was all because Ireland didn't have her own parliament, and because Ireland was governed by people who did not understand Ireland, who did not care about Ireland, and had no interest in looking after it. And so, knowing that he was dying, he decided to set out to Rome to get a blessing from the Pope before he died. But before that, he went to the House of Commons in Westminster for one final speech, because he wanted to plead for the lives of the Irish people. And this was in February 1847, the worst year of the famine. And he decided against an angry speech. He wasn't going to rebuke the Parliament for its failures in Ireland. He wasn't going to say, I told you so. This is why we should have our own Parliament. Instead, he threw himself at the mercy of the Parliament. He said, this is your opportunity to show that you were right and I was wrong. Save my people. If you don't, millions will die. But the problem is, the tragedy is, the wand of the magician was broken. O'Connell's voice had gone completely, and he wasn't able to project his voice. He wasn't able to be heard. And so if you look at Hansard, it begins uniquely. Mr. O'Connell was understood to have said, because they were forced to reconstruct the speech afterwards from his notes. And yet, even though they could not hear a word of what O'Connell was saying, and even though they were watching him deliver this speech like a mime show, and even though this was the person who had bullied and tormented them and teased and mocked them for the past 17 years in the British House of Commons, they listened in absolute respectful silence because they recognised O'Connell as one of the greatest parliamentary gladiators of the 19th century, and they knew that this was a man who was delivering his final speech. And O'Connell made his way to Genoa, and there, heartbroken, feeling he had betrayed the Irish people by having failed with repeal, he died. And he was brought back, and even in that worst year of the famine, hundreds of thousands of people came out for his burial and for that funeral at Glasnevin Cemetery. And I think in the years ahead, O'Connell's stock was very high, but then his stock fell. Because after 1916 and Irish independence, there was very much a recognition that Irish independence had been achieved through the men and women of violence. It had been achieved through force, through physical force, and that O'Connell's strategy had been proven to be wrong. And I think it's now only 100 years on that we're reaching maybe a more balanced and nuanced perspective and recognizing that it's possible to recognize that the women and men of the revolutionary generation helped create the Irish state, but that it was O'Connell in the 19th century who helped create the modern Irish nation. And he did that by raising the Irish people from their knees. And that was recognised by Eamon de Valera as President of Ireland when he opened Derrynane as a public heritage site in 1967. He said at that he had hated O'Connell and that his revolutionary generation had hated O'Connell because they had not understood or appreciated the scale of his achievement. And he said they were wrong. They would never have been able to achieve all that was achieved from 1916 on if O'Connell had not won his great victories in the 19th century. That O'Connell had taken a people who were on its knees and he had convinced them that they were more than slaves. And that's why even though we have a statue of O'Connell 1,000 meters away, even though we have a wonderful statue of O'Connell just upstairs, I think there is room for another statue of O'Connell, the young O'Connell, because O'Connell was someone who took a people that were broken, destroyed, without any hope, and he convinced them that they were more than slaves. And that's why I think he should be considered our chieftain, our hero, and our liberator. Thank you.